Welcome to Real Estate Resource. Thanks for stopping by. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you'll know when new videos are available. I really hope you enjoy this one. So, since we have officially entered the era of no compensation on the MLS, and I've been getting quite a bit of phone call questions and people here walking up to the desk, I thought that what would be best for all of you would be to give you an opportunity to ask whatever questions you guys have in relation to how you're going to continue to do your business, right? With the practice changes, the structure of what that looks like, the how you kind of maneuver through it. So it is going to be your forum. So it's up to you guys what direction we go and what we cover. So who wants to start? Who's the guinea pig? All right, Tina Louise. Absolutely. Go for it, Tina.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
I'm going on a listing appointment tomorrow, and I reviewed the contract. I am going to request, obviously my compensation, but I was asking other agents who have taken listings in the last couple of weeks from other offices, how they're asking if they're paying buyer side and what they're doing. Well, I'm going to ask, but I was wondering, can I put that in an addendum?
The answer to that question is a definite no. There could be nothing in writing compelling the seller to pay compensation. That's the point of the lawsuit. The point of the lawsuit was that we were manipulating the sellers into the belief that they were required to pay a buyer's agent. And that really wasn't true. I mean, it was based on, the MLS required you to put compensation in, but there was nothing that said, there was no law that said that the seller was required to pay compensation. And so what the lawsuit really was saying that because NAR and the MLS is conspired together, they made it required for a seller to pay compensation to a buyer's broker, even though the compensation that they were paying was technically to us as the listing broker and we were sharing it with another broker. It became, an issue with semantics because the way that listing agent sold it was you're paying me $3 and you're paying somebody else $3, when in reality it was you're paying me $6, $5, $4, whatever, and I'm sharing a portion of that as my overhead. So no, there is no way that you can't put an addendum in. You can't write anywhere on here that the sellers agree to pay any compensation to a buyer's broker. That compensation is strictly a negotiating point in a purchase agreement from this point forward. So like in your case, Tina, you're going on a listing appointment today. The conversation you're going to be having with your seller is going to look something like, hey, I've prepared some net sheets for you. Here's one where you're paying X amount of compensation. Here's another one where you're paying a different amount of compensation. And here's one where you're paying $0. And maybe you want to adjust those net sheets based on what you believe the effect of no compensation will have on the period of time to sell it. How the sales price may be affected by no compensation being offered. And then you show them that way. And then you tell them, by the way, this is all up to you. And it could change based on the strength or the weakness of an offer that we receive. So it's just now a conversation. Maybe the only thing you reference it in is a net sheet. And now it's going to be the conversations you have with agents. So no, please don't put it in an addendum or anything else on the listing agreement. So I hope that clarified that for you, Tina. Okay, Jesus, go ahead.
I totally get what you're saying about the different net sheets according to the commission, possible commission selling agent. But don't we have in the listing agreement a spot for buyers without agents with being representative?
No, we have a section in compensation that is for a buyer that chooses to remain unrepresented. It's not an amount of compensation for a buyer that has an agent, for you acting as the buyer's agent. It is for an agent that is unrepresented. And as a matter of fact, since we're going to talk about it,
And how do we charge that one? Or who do we charge to?
I'm sharing the screen, so you guys should be looking at right now the compensation. So here's the compensation. And again, to clarify, this is any compensation that we negotiate in this contract is only the compensation that the seller is paying for me as listing agent, listing broker, for representing their side of the transaction. So this section down here, that's 4C2, where it says I'm sorry, 2C2. I got confused too. 2C2, additional compensation to seller's broker if buyer is unrepresented. Basically, what that's saying is, look, if a buyer comes in and says, I have no money, I have enough money to buy the house, but I don't have enough money to pay compensation to a buyer's broker. So I've chosen not to sign a buyer representation and broker compensation agreement with a buyer's agent, even if that buyer's agent is also the listing agent. I've chosen not to sign that because I know I cannot pay those funds. I can't pay that compensation. So I still want to buy your house. I still want to submit an offer. What this is saying is, what's the additional compensation for me as listing agent acting in the interest of the seller for me to prepare the offer, have the buyer sign a non-agency agreement, and then communicate with the buyer just to provide them with the documents that my seller's required to provide them with, not advise them on them, not guide them through them, just make sure that the buyer is staying on the time periods that are required in the contract that we agreed to. So what is the amount of compensation you believe you deserve for that extra amount of work? That's what that is. You're not representing that buyer. This is not an additional compensation for that. You are not. If you want to represent a buyer and get paid, you have to do what every other buyer agent does as listing agent, is have the buyer sign a buyer representation or broker compensation agreement and negotiate the commission with your seller as if you were a buyer's agent. That's it. So that's what that compensation piece is for. When you're looking at this listing agreement, it's not about them agreeing to what they're going to offer to anybody else or what they're going to offer to you to represent a buyer. It is only in the situation where a buyer walks in and says, I want it. I have a good down payment. I have good credit, but I don't have the money to pay compensation to a broker.
The agent. However, you're saying that we're providing the forms to the buyers, or we're providing?
Well, you're gonna have to, unless you're willing to have the buyer go online, find a purchase agreement that isn't a CAR purchase agreement, fill it out on their own, you negotiate it. You're going to have a non-agency agreement with them anyway, and the purchase agreement as you write it is not going to have your name as the buyer's agent. Perfect. So you're not going to have any kind of fiduciary duty to them, even if you draft the offer, just because you're working on behalf of your seller, the terms that your seller wants to agree to purchase the home. Because I don't, like in this case, let's say that you walk in as an unrepresented buyer and I say, okay, well, if you want me to represent you, you have to sign one of these forms and commit to pay compensation. You're like, no, I'm not going to do it. Okay. I will draft an offer that are the terms that my seller wants. And if you're willing to sign it, then my seller will move forward with you. And you're going to sign a form that says, I have no fiduciary duty to you and you're on your own. So now what I've done is I've worked on behalf of my seller because I drafted the offer in the terms that my seller would agree to. I didn't do any representation of the buyer. I solely represented my seller and said to buyer, if you're okay with the terms that my seller wants, then you're good to go. And this is what the process is going forward because you've chosen not to be represented. I don't think there's going to be as many non-represented buyers as we think there may be, or enough to be concerned with how much my compensation is going to be for that. Okay. All right. So we got Danny's got a question. Let's go. Go ahead, Danny.
Thank you, Kyle, for taking my question. So this is very helpful in the process of the questions that are being asked, because that's actually on my question list as well. Mm-hmm. I have a different question to ask in regards to, say, we've talked to our seller, and we've prepared them ahead of time to go ahead and obviously pay the listing agent commission, which is us at this time. But what about, we've already asked them to take care, to negotiate, cooperate if a buyer comes and does not have money to be able to pay their agent, to cooperate and facilitate commission to that selling agent that's representing the buyer.
Okay.
Where do we stipulate that? I know that we stipulate, well, the agent representing the buyer is going to stipulate that on the contract, on the seller's payment for broker, buyer broker, on the offer. I get that. But where do we stipulate something like that on the multiple listing service?
You don't. You cannot reference compensation at all on the MLS. Nothing. You can't even put an amount of concessions that the seller is willing to pay. So, for example, in the MLS, you guys all know, I'm sure you've looked at it, they've removed the BAC, the buyer's compensation section from the MLS. That's gone. They have added a concessions little tab, right, where it's either yes or no concessions. That's it. You can't even in private remarks say, my seller is willing to offer 2% of the sales price in concessions. All you can say is seller is open to negotiate concessions. That's it. You can't reference anything that would give even the slightest inclination that you're paying compensation to a buyer's broker. That would be a violation, and it's an automatic. Like, the thing is that, and for those of you guys that haven't been on, CRMLS has had some really good, Zoom town halls and some things. If you haven't been on them and you see that they exist and you go, it's the CAR, the CRMLS attorneys that are on there, and they're talking about what CRMLS is doing. And CRMLS is actually putting in practice some things that are going to help you guys, because they're already putting filters in on private and public remarks for words that would be forbidden, that could lead towards that compensation, direction. And what it'll do is, when you start typing your private and public remarks, like it does now, I think it does for some things. Like if you start to put like house is vacant or whatever, it pops up and tells you, you can't use those words. It's going to do that. If anything says it looks like compensation or a percentage or anything like that, it's going to have that filter that says, hey, you can't use these words in your private or public remarks. So they're putting some things in to help you guys, so that even if you, not thinking, just type something, they're going to try to protect you. But please don't reference anything about compensation anywhere on the MLS, because it's an automatic $2,500 fine, and there is no fighting it. There's no warning. There's no appeal. It is automatically a $2,500 fine if there's anything referencing compensation to a buyer's broker in the MLS.
So the correct verbiage to place on there is seller is open to concessions.
That's what I would put. Seller is open to negotiate concessions, right? That's it. That's it. However the buyer wants to use the concessions, that's up to the buyer. Like, the buyer could say, okay, well, I'm going to ask for, 2% of the purchase price because I have the money to pay my closing costs, but I don't have money to pay closing costs and my agent. So I'm going to use the concessions that come from that to pay my agent. And the lenders are already okay with that, right? They've already waived that idea that if there's something that the buyer has to pay and those are not connected to the loan, they're not going to limit those credits. Okay. So it would just be concessions, and then the buyer can use those concessions however they want as closing costs. So
thank you very much.
You're welcome. Janelle, go ahead.
Hi, good morning. Okay,
good morning.
So question I have is, like, for Instagram and Facebook and stuff, when we're posting videos of the property, can we say anything about commission?
Yeah.
Okay, so we can say seller's giving 2% commission, whatever.
On your Instagram, you could do it because it's your personal Instagram. The only things you can't post it on are, like, if your website is an IDX site, it can't be part of the terms that are going to get farmed out to another IDX site, right? So, like, your personal website, your sign writers, your flyers, your Instagram and Facebook, you can put that the seller is willing to pay compensation to a buyer's broker.
Okay, so sign writers are cool because I've seen a couple that people are putting like 2% commission and it goes right on top of the sign.
Yeah, sign writers are fine.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Tony. Are you there, Tony?
Hi, Kyle. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so can we still continue to put it in our net sheets for the sellers to kind of basically mentally prepare them to pay X amount of dollars towards compensation?
Yeah, and I think, I mentioned it a little bit ago at the very beginning, and I've had this conversation with agents ago. I think if you're going to do it, it's probably better to have a couple net sheets, right? That show the full compensation you think is what is going to take to sell the property, a modified amount of compensation, and zero paid. And I think as long as we have those in files, what'll happen is if instead of giving, like, if my net sheet only shows the compensation and there's some kind of a disagreement and they say, well, they made it look like I had to pay, at least if you have those other net sheets that are acknowledged by the seller, you could say, well, no, I gave them an option and here's where they acknowledged the other net sheets and they chose to go with this one where we're offering 2% or where they were open to 2%. And then remember too, is that that's not also set. Even if I say in my net sheet to my seller, right, I'm talking to you, Tony, and I say, Tony, I think it would be best if we offer if you're open to offering 2%. Because if we let people know that, hey, you're willing to offer up to 2%, doesn't mean we have to pay them the whole 2%. It could be dependent on the strength of the offer. So when these offers come in and maybe it's a little less than you wanted, or not only is it that they're asking for us to pay the 2% compensation, but they need a credit for their buyer. Because that's going to happen too, right? There's still buyers out there that need closing cost credits. And even when our MLS was allowing us to share our compensation with another buyer's broker, your seller was paying that 4%, 5%, 6% of the, for compensation, whether it was to you or to somebody else. And then they were paying the credits on top of it. So it's not crazy to believe that there's going to be offers that are asking for the compensation and asking for a credit. But maybe the ones that are asking for a credit, you don't have to pay the full compensation because there's no requirement to anymore. So we have to start looking at the benefit to the seller and how we can negotiate the compensation where we're not locked in. We're not locked, that seller's not locked into a specific compensation. So, I mean, if think about it as a listing agent, if I know that they have to pay a specific amount of compensation and they're required to because we committed it to contract, and then get an offer where it's asking for, $5,000 or $10,000 in closing costs, I got to go to the seller and sell them on why it's okay to give this $10,000 credit, even though they're paying $24,000 in commissions already. Right. That was a sales job for us as the listing agent. Now, when I go back, I could go to the seller and say, hey, look, they're asking for these credits. We could, if you want to net more, we could adjust the compensation down to, allow for these credits. So for us as buyer's agents, you've got to get to the point where you're able to negotiate why the offer is better, right? Why you have a strong offer, even if you're asking for credits. And so I think what's going to happen is you're going to start seeing that the buyer's agents that are good at what they do are going to be taking on less of those buyers that require that credit. They're going to be a little bit more discerning about the buyers they're working with because they want to be able to negotiate their compensation. I think that's what's going to happen.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Anybody else? I like this. I like answering questions like this. That's it. Every one of you, the rest of the 94 of you that are on here all understand everything that's happening. Shy. Not Jesus. Jesus will always ask a question. Go ahead, Jesus.
Thank you. I wrote it on the text.
Oh, sorry. I got to go down through there.
That's okay. I couldn't type it properly because I was paying attention at the same time. So we're giving 3 net sheets, which makes sense. What would be the price difference that we suggest we tell the sellers from not giving compensation to the selling agent to giving it? Because
you could get an idea of, look, what's time on market. If we look at before compensation changes and we look at what time on market was, you could go back because in the MLS still, anything that closed, expired, it still shows the compensation that was paid. right? So all the old ones that have closed still show the compensation. So if I'm going on a listing appointment and I'm trying to sell to a seller why they need to pay compensation, maybe one of the things I do as I look at comparables in the MLS is I look at the compensation that was being offered and I look at days on market and I look at sales price, list price versus sales price. Did it sell for more? Did it sell for less? How long was it on the market? And I start to use those things as how I determine. So like if I look at something that was 1.5%, because those were out there, right? And we had a conversation recently with an agent where they were only offering 1.5. Those 1.5s were there, the 2s were there, the 2.5s and the 3s were there. And if I can look at it, I can figure out based on the comparables, hey, look at these with the lower commissions that were being offered were on the market longer than those with the higher commission. And if I can articulate that to my seller and explain to them what the benefit is to them being open to negotiating, not having to pay, but being open to negotiating with a buyer's agent based on the strength of the offer, it's going to make our property easier to sell. And I think ultimately at the beginning, it's probably going to be a little bit more difficult to have that conversation because we're not going to be able to see how long it takes for the houses that were offering zero compensation because we won't know, right? So it's going to be hard to determine that later. But I think as we start to set up based on what we know from the past and how buyers agents behave, right? Because you guys know the truth. If it was a high compensation offer or listing, if it was offering you 2.5, 2.75, 3%, those were at the top of the list. If it was met your buyer's criteria, you showed those first. And that's exactly what's going to happen with these buyer's agents because they know that the majority of the buyers that they're representing, even though they're signing this buyer representation agreement, are probably not going to be able to afford to pay them. They're going to be asking everybody that they talk to, are you paying compensation? How much is it? And they're going to determine, and they shouldn't, but they are, they're going to determine which properties they show their buyers first. It's going to happen the same way. It's just we can't facilitate it by making it, having it be mandatory for the seller to pay something. But we know that if the seller doesn't pay anything, it's going to be a longer process. And I think that's the conversation we have to have with them. Let's see. Let me look at a couple other questions. I'll get to you in just a second, Joseph. When you draft up the terms, is that on a specific form also? What's the form called that we aren't represent the buyer? Okay, so when that's the case, when you're not going to represent the buyer, there's a form called buyer non-agency, and you're going to have the buyer sign that as part of them not being represented by you. $2,500 fine, no warning. Yes, Sarah, thumbs up. We do a sign writer. We already went over that. 2 clicks away. Well, we set the amount extra seller. Okay. Let's see. Can the seller's broker pay commission to the buyer's broker? There's really nothing that allows for that because there's no forms, there's no MLS, there's nothing. So really the idea of a broker sharing compensation is pretty much dead. It's gonna come from the seller. Which form do I use? Can you please refresh us on the open house forms? Yes, I will do that right after I answer Joseph's question. Go ahead, Joseph.
So can we, I don't know if you answered this, but can we like in the description or somewhere in the private remarks put like a website and then it link and you click there that goes to your listing, then it has no? Don't give me that look, Kyle. I'm
not giving you a look. I'm just no, you can't. You can't do it because then what happens is we're doing the same thing. If there was a link directly from the MLS to a website that showed, that it would be, might as well just put the compensation in. No, that wouldn't be allowed. Yeah. Okay, so they were asking about the admin, I didn't mean to hit ask to unmute. Open house and the short-term representation stuff. Let's get down to that. Where is it? Oops, not there. Okay, let me add it from here then. So we can look at that. We're going to add that. Property. Sorry, I'm trying to find the forms right now. Okay, so they're in here. Sorry, guys. They're just, I'm having a hard time finding them on here. Oh, there it is. Okay, so let's open that. And okay, so let's look at the open house form first, which is good because this is now in effect. So this weekend, when you guys are holding open houses, you're gonna have to use this. So here it is. This is the open house open house visitor, non-agency disclosure and sign-in. So basically what this is saying is like, I am having this house open as a benefit to my seller. You as a buyer are coming into this open house, and any information I share with you is only in my representation of seller. It's to benefit my seller. And so what you're going to do is you're going to sign in here and you're going to agree that we don't have an agency together, no fiduciary duty. And if you have an agent, here's your agent's information and here is your email and phone number, your contact information. I need you to write that in. So I've had a couple agents ask me if they don't want to sign this, do I have to let them into the open house? And the answer is no, you don't. Now, it's up to you if you want to let them in still and come look around and do all that stuff, but they need to sign this. Okay. They have to sign it to come in, because what this does is it's protecting you from anybody being able to say you were advising them on real estate, showing them property without having a buyer representation agreement. Because if that happens, again, it's another $2,500 fine for you guys. So I would suggest that instead of having the now visitor books that we've been using or sign-in sheets, this is what we have. Now, there's only, I think, 7 or 8 spots. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's only 7 spots. So if you think you're going to have a busy open house, you're going to have to print multiples of these so that you can have them and have people sign in. And nobody gets a copy of it. This is not a form that they have to sign and agree to and you give it back to them. It's just them acknowledging that you're not representing them in any way. There's no agency. So you have to do that. Now, let's say I'm at the open house. That person walks in. I have them sign this. And after they look around, they say, I don't have an agent. I really like this house. I would like you to represent me. Perfect. That's what we all want, right? That's the point of having the open house. So if that's the case, then what I would do is then have them sign this form. Oh, I gotta fix that. That bothers me. I would have them sign this form. The property showing and representation agreement for use with prospective buyer for up to 3 open house or other properties only. So we're at my open house. They say, yes, we want it. I put the property address in for my open house. Right? Whatever the address is going to be, I put it in. We do the representation period. It could only be 30 days. How much compensation they're agreeing to pay me, just like the BRBC, but it's very short. It's just a few pages, right? It's 3 pages instead of like the BRBC, which is more intense. And now I have the right to now discuss the property with them as their agent and to negotiate on their behalf when I submit offers to my seller. Okay. So that's what's going to have to happen from now on when you guys are doing your open houses. Let's see. So Adeseli, I hope that answered your question. And if you have another question about that, please let me know. I'm going to stop the share for a second here. Okay, let's see what's next. Joseph, what are all the forms we need to submit with an offer to request compensation? Terrific. Let me get those ready and then let me get them all up here and we can look at those. So you're going to need, obviously, the residential purchase agreement. You're going to need the buyer representation and broker compensation, and you're going to need the SPB, which is the seller's payment to buyer's broker. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and share again so you guys can see them, and we'll look at each one of those. Okay, so you should be looking at right now, this is the RPA, right? So as I write my offer normally, when I get down here to 3G3, I'm going to check off this box that says seller agrees to pay the obligation of buyer to compensate buyer's broker under a separate agreement. Form SPBB is attached. So I'm going to do that. I have to check the box and attach the form. And then we're going to go to the SPBB and we're going to look at that. And what that states here is subject to paragraph 1B below, and we'll talk about that in a second. Seller agrees to pay broker 2%, 3%, 4%, whatever it is you guys negotiate of the purchase price, or if checked, a flat rate. Now, the reason the flat rate is going to be expensive is because it's going to be important is because sometimes the ability to negotiate my compensation is going to be based on the sales price, right? And if I do it by a percentage, the higher the sales price goes, the more compensation the seller has to pay. So for example, the sale price is 600,000. I want my compensation. So I'm going to say, okay, well, I want, $12,000 for a compensation. That'd be 2%. I'm just going to raise the price to 612 and make it a flat rate of $12,000. And that's how I'm going to get paid. Now, the important part of this is says, if there is no buyer representation agreement, then seller has no obligation to pay buyer's broker, because the seller can agree to pay you whatever they want, but it has to be the same amount or less than the amount that you negotiated on your buyer representation and broker compensation agreement. So the maximum amount of money you can make is whatever you've negotiated on this form, the buyer representation and broker compensation form. That's what's going to determine how much you get. So even if the seller says, hey, man, I'll give you 4% if you sell it at the price I want. If you've negotiated 2 with your buyer, you get paid 2. And that's it. Okay. So you have to understand how that part works. That's one of the most important things, because everybody thinks that, okay, well, hey, I'm going to get 4%. Well, no, you're going to get whatever you agreed to get paid by your buyer. So to just go back on the question in the chat, you need along with your RPA, you need the SPBB, the seller's payment to buyer's broker, and you need the BRBC, the buyer representation and broker compensation agreement. That's going to have to be submitted with your offers from now on. Okay. So hope I got you, Joseph. Darwin, I'll get to you in a second. I just want to check chat to see what we got here. All right. So say we submitted an offer when compensation was offered and the sellers make a decision on the offers after the 17th. Is the seller obligated to pay the commission initially offered? Yes. And remember, it's not the seller paying it. It's the listing broker that's paying that. So hopefully you had an MLS printout from prior to the 17th that showed what the compensation was. The listing agent should be submitting a copy of the old listing agreement to escrow as to what the costs are anyway. So that should get handled in escrow. But yeah, those should be honored. If you got your offer accepted prior to the 17th or wrote your offer prior to the 17th, that should all be honored. Doesn't mean it necessarily will. Listing agents and sellers and they don't necessarily understand that change. They're thinking that that's gone now, so they don't have to pay it. So you still may have to negotiate it, but technically, yes, that should be honored still. Let me see. What was the name of the form for open house again? Is the open house, where is it? It is, sorry, I'm still learning the names. Open house, visitor, non-agency, and sign-in. Okay, that's the open house form. Let's see. After the open house, what do we do with the form? Store in SkySlope? Yeah, we'll store wherever you're going to store. Whatever you do, hold on to it. I would hold on to stuff. For you guys as agents, you're supposed to hold on to rejected offers and things like that for a year. So I'd get prepared to have some kind of electronic file, because a year's worth of those is going to get a lot. So yeah, scan it and store it somewhere electronically. Let's see. Can I see the form? Okay, Daniel SPB. Then it is best to always request 3% of the buyer representation. Sure, it's always best to request 3%, but the issue you're dealing with is that then your buyer's committing to pay you 3%. Right? The buyer's committed to pay you 3%. If you can't negotiate 3%, then technically your buyer would be on the hook for the balance of whatever compensation you're getting from the seller and that 3% that they agreed to. So again, if you have the ability to show your value to a buyer, and that value gets you to allows for you to get them to commit to 3%, go for it, get the 3%. But I think also one of the things that I would suggest that you guys do is get comfortable with a number that you feel is your value, and if and maybe you change it based on what you believe the buyers can afford or not. Because I know I've had a lot of questions where people ask, can you modify the agreement after the fact? And like, for example, if I negotiated a 2% on my BRBC and the seller's willing to pay me 3%, can I change my BRBC to 3%? Well, yeah, you can, but you got to be able to have a conversation with the buyer and explain to them why now they have to commit to pay you more, or why there's getting more paid when I have to explain to them that this is the maximum I can get paid when they first sign it. So now what we're saying is that if I'm buying this house as buyer, and I agreed to pay you 2%, but now the seller wants to pay you more, why should you get paid more? Why can't we reduce the cost of the house? Instead of me saying, yes, it's okay for you to get that 1%, why can't we just reduce the price by 1% and get me a better deal? So, I mean, these are some of the conversations you're going to have with buyers. So if your thought process is, I'm going to convince my buyer to increase the amount of compensation they pay me so I can get that bigger compensation from the seller, I think it might be a tougher conversation than you believe. If it isn't, great. Yes, you can do that. If your buyer agrees to it, yes, you can do it. But, just be prepared that that's going to be the conversations you're going to have. Will those forms auto attach the RPA? I mean, the SPBB will auto attach the RPA because you have to check that box, but the BRBC will not because it's a separate form. Let's see. Kyle, how do we prove to the buyer that the seller is paying compensation? Well, because when you fill out the SPBB, it's part of that. You know what I mean? Like, they're going to see that. Back to open house. What if 3 or 4 families arrive at the same time and they don't want to sign on the form? What if they just say, I'm just going to check it out real quick? Again, that's up to you if you want to allow them to do that without signing. That's your choice. That's a business decision on your part, because the consequences are yours. Right? If they say that they were being like that, you showed them the property and you don't have any proof that you didn't, that's on you. So it's up to you. Okay, let's see. Okay, got it. Thanks. Okay, Darwin, go ahead. Let me see. Sorry, I don't have the people open there. Okay, Darwin, go ahead.
Hey, boss, as a buyer agent, and you call the listing agent, say, yes, seller is willing to pay you 2%. You have to submit the form together with the offer, or you submit the form for your compensation first?
Everything has to go with the offer. Everything has to go with the offer. And your buyer representation and broker compensation agreement had to be done prior to you even showing a property. So the thing is that you're not going to do a new BRBC every time that you're showing a property. So I might write up a BRBC with you today at 2%, and the property that we find isn't until, next week. And I have to submit it with the one that existed from the beginning. All right, let's see. What do we have here? Boom. Okay, there's nothing else in the chat. Anybody else? I mean, I know that some things are going to come up for you guys as you get more into the process, but I had a phone call today from an agent, and again, the seller should be honoring the compensation that I know. I'll get to him in just a second. Oh, there he goes. There's Armando. Look at him on vacation and still here.
Look got you.
Yeah.
So question, Kyle. So here's the way I'm thinking that we should all work with this buyer representation. I mean, compensation form. Okay, if I'm going to say you're my client, Kyle, okay, we're going to go see properties. I'm going to call First Street, Third Street, whatever street it is. And then I'm assuming what I'm going to do is I'm going to print out a bunch of these buyer representation agreements that day. And then, okay, you're paying, this one's paying 2%. I'm going to fill out, okay, this one I already know is paying 2% because I'm going to call before. So I'm going to have these forms already ready for each property with what they're going to pay me. Pay 2.5, and then I'll just have them sign them that day. Wouldn't that just be our easiest way instead of having this modified every single time?
Yeah and no. The problem is, well, I mean, yeah, I guess you could, but
Yeah,
I
That's
feel
why I'm
like
thinking that way we don't have to redo these forms.
I
I'm gonna
feel like
set up my
that's
showing.
I feel like that's a little bit more cumbersome than it needs to be. I mean, look, here's the other thing too, is that part of the DOJ issue that we're having, that they're, they still haven't really, 100% signed off on these new practice measures, right? For the settlement and to get the Department of Justice off NAR's back, was one of the issues they had was steering, right? Now you guys know what steering is, right? And that's what we just mentioned earlier when we were having the conversation, is that buyers agents would take their buyers to the property that was paying them the highest compensation, and maybe not the right property for them, but the one that was going to compensate them the most. And I think if that was one of the major issues that people were having as an antitrust thing for NAR and for us as realtors, across the country, doing multiple buyer representation agreements,
For the property, I'm seeing for each property, because I'm
Well,
just gonna call First Street, Third Street, you're gonna pay
yeah,
me two, you're gonna pay two and a half.
I get that, but so I see what you're saying. You're like, it doesn't matter if they're offering me two, I'm gonna put two. If they're offering one, I'm gonna write one.
That way I don't have to be, redoing all these forms and going back.
Yeah.
That way I just, have it
Well,
already. And if you like it,
But
just-
I mean, to be completely honest, you don't have to continue to redo them. You only redo them once you get an offer accept, like once you're in escrow. So if I write, let's say that I just say, okay, I'm going to agree to 2% with my buyer, and whatever we negotiate, or I'm going to skate 3%, and I'm willing to, with my buyer, we have a handshake or whatever I get paid is what I'm going to get paid. And when I get my offer accepted and the seller says, I know you have 3, but I'm only paying 2, and you do that modification of the 2 to your buyer so they're not on the hook for the 1, you've only done it once you've got them accepted. So, I mean, it's not that you're going to modify it with every offer. You're going to modify it once it gets accepted, dependent on the relationship you have with the buyer and the compensation amount that you've created. Like, my thing is like, I don't think it's going to be as easy as we believe to modify the compensation up, right? Like if I'm working with you as a buyer, Armando, let's be honest, and I've negotiated, hey, you're going to pay me 2.5. You're okay with that based on the value you think I provide. You're cool with 2.5, and then we find a house that you love, and that seller says, hey, I'll pay you 3, and I come back to you and say, hey, Armando, I need to change our buyer representation agreement to 3% because this seller says they're going to pay me 3. Right? Think about if there was any other service provider that was doing that, you would be like, well, wait a minute, couldn't I save that 0.5 point? But you could do it. Once it gets like that one, you'd have to do prior to getting accepted because you're making it up, right? But if the seller says, hey, I can only pay 2, and I say, Armando, I know you agreed to pay me 2.5. I don't want you to be on the hook for the 0.5. So we're going to go ahead and agree on the 2. And once you get your offer accepted, then I'm going to negotiate you down to the 2% because we found the house you love, and I want you to have it.
Okay, and then it's under the modification, because I'm in right on the form.
There's modification of buyer representation of broker compensation. There's a disclosure and modification, which is for old buyer representation agreements, but should be a modification that's for the new ones. And you know what? I'll bring it up right now.
Yeah, I don't see it. I'm looking for it. I don't see it.
Let's bring it up right now so you guys can see it. Modification of terms, buyer representation. It's already in my library. Listing. Here it is. There it is.
What's the abbreviation?
It is. Hold on, I'm going to bring it up on the screen right now so you guys can see it. And there it goes. This you should be looking at right now. Modification of terms, buyer representation agreement.
What's the initial? What is it called? The
MT-BR.
MT-BR. There it is.
Yeah.
Okay.
So just like with your listing and the list, there's one for listing agreements, looks exactly the same. It just says listing agreement. But that's what you would use. If I need to change it up or down, change the extension, the whole thing.
Management approval if an associate licensed by broker office have entered into this month. Okay, term broker manager has a right to cap within 5 days.
Yep. So just like the listing agreement, it's the same thing there. We can extend the escrow, we can change the compensation, any other terms that we may want to change. Buyer signs, we sign it, and now we've modified the BRBC. So I think that it's going to be more likely for us when we're doing it to say, look, I only want to get compensated what the seller's willing to. I'm not going to put you on the hook for the difference, but this is what we're going to negotiate, you and I, that you're paying, and then we submit offers and I request it. If they don't pay it, then it's just like, look, think of it the same way as closing cost credits. I'm sure we've had many buyers prior to this change that needed closing cost credits in order to buy their house. They didn't have the cash. And if we wrote an offer on a property that they fell in love with and that credit couldn't get paid, the seller said, no, I can't pay that credit. What was our buyer's choice? They had to move on to another house. And in this case, if my buyer knows they can't pay me the compensation, we're going to request it just like we would a seller credit. And if the seller says, no, I can't pay that compensation, then the buyer has the right to say, I'll figure out how to pay you, or we have to go find something else. It's that same model as credits. So that's the way we have to just kind of attack it and have that conversation with the buyers. Like, hey, listen, you have to pay closing costs on your loan. You know that's going to happen. And if you need that from a seller, we're going to request it. But if the seller won't give it to you, then we'll have to move on to something else. Same thing is, you know that you have to agree to pay me compensation in order to have an agent represent your best interest in the purchase. We're going to ask the seller to pay it. But if the seller can't pay it and you can't pay it, then we're going to have to move on to another house. I mean, that's the honest truth, that we have that conversation with the buyers.
Right. Okay.
So, but I don't think there's anything wrong with what you're doing. I think it just feels like that's a lot of extra work. That's all.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Let's see. There's some other stuff in chat here. Let's see. When representing a buyer, when you submit an offer, you have to include the following forms for the listing agent: RPA, BRBC, and the SPB. Yes, that's correct. That is correct. Okay. All right. Anybody else? I mean, we could end a little early if you guys don't have questions. I really figured there were going to be a lot more questions, especially after the meeting that we had a couple of weeks ago when I was answering the questions live in person. Matthew, yes, go right ahead.
Hey, Kyle. So is there an official compensation schedule that is CAR form, or is this something you could draft up yourself?
No, just something you draft up. Yeah.
Okay.
You could just put it on just a piece of paper and make sure it just has signatures on it. Attach it to this. Yeah.
So technically, if we wanted to, if we say, hey, we could say 3% commission, we'll sign the buyer broker, and then we'll tell the buyer on this compensation schedule, buyer to pay up to 1% difference in commissions. Let's say the seller's willing to pay 2% and the buyer's willing to pay 1%.
Yeah. So they're agreed to paying 3%. Basically, what you're saying is, like, if you agree to pay 3% and they pay 2%, you're going to pay 1%. If they only pay me 1%, you're still only going to pay 1%. So you're not going to pay the full 3%. You're just going to pay 2%. You're going to pay 1%. No matter what, it's going to be 1% out of your pocket.
And I'm saying this only because I want to make sure that we get the full amount of commission, and then what we could search is after those, those properties are you know what I'm saying? So that way we don't get capped at a certain commission.
What would happen, what should happen is, on your BRBC, you wouldn't put that 3% on the front page. You would just put as per attached commission schedule or compensation schedule. And then on the compensation schedule, you would write, buyer agrees to pay a maximum of 3% of the sales price on any accepted listing. If compensation is being paid by the seller, the buyer will pay, 1% additional compensation over the compensation paid by the seller, up to a maximum of 3%, maybe something like that.
Oh, got it. Okay.
Right. So that way, what you're saying is like the most you're going to pay is 3%. But if they reduce the commission a lot, then it's 1% more that you're going to pay. Right. If they only pay 1%, you're going to pay 1%. I'll get 2%. If they're going to pay 2%, you're going to pay 1%, and I'm going to get 3%. I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Okay. That way we don't get capped out at that 3%. And then,
You're going to get capped at the 3.
Or
You're
sorry,
going to get capped at 3. It doesn't.
I was thinking 2
yeah,
because I had them at 2, and I was like, wait, you know,
yeah. So just remember that you got to have that first standard commission because that's going to be your max, right? So if you just put a buyer to pay 1% over whatever seller pays, well, now there's nothing agreed to, so the seller doesn't really have to pay you anything. Right, the seller could say,
Right.
okay, well, I don't have to pay you anything because there's no set commission that they're paying. But if you say buyer's going to pay 3, but if there is compensation from a third party, and maybe I would put it that way, not put it as seller compensation, put compensation from a third party, then buyer will be responsible to pay 1% additional compensation over that compensation paid by a third party.
Got it. Okay.
Cool. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
All right, you're welcome. Let's see, we got something else down here. Can you please reshare the docs? Should we have an open house? It's the OHNA, and it's the OHNA is the open house visitor non-agency, and then the property showing and representation agreement is the short-term representation agreement for 3 properties. The PSRA replaces the PSRA replaces the BRBC. That is correct. The PSRA is the property showing and representation agreement. Okay. When our buyers go to open houses by themselves, so they have to take the signed agreement and show it to the agent who is open? No, they don't. They just need to tell them that they have a signed agreement with you. Can we see an example of what the compensation schedule could look like? I don't really have one as a compensation. Like I said, it's just going to be a piece of paper where we write what the terms of the compensation are. So I don't really have a draft to show you guys. So it's going to be a kind of a case-by-case basis depending on what it is that your schedule is going to look like. The schedule could be based on the amount of purchase price, right? If it could be based on the amount of credits that the buyer requires. It could be a lot of things that you could put on there as to what limits the amount that the buyer pays. Okay. Any other questions before I let you guys go? All right. Well, again, if you missed the beginning of this and we didn't cover a question you had, or maybe we covered it and you missed it, this is going to be on YouTube later today. If you need to get a hold of me, you could always get a hold of me by email, text, phone, whatever. If you're watching this on YouTube later and you don't work with me, you can email me. All right. Well, thank you guys. I appreciate it. Again, you need anything else, please let me know. And I'll see you guys again in a week. So take care of yourself, be productive. And if you need anything, you know where to get me.